First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this wonderful symposium, it is just great to listen to this wonderful presentations by my esteemed colleagues. My presentation is a bit different in the sense that we will be exploring the experience of prisoners of war on the other side of Europe in a very different environment from the warm climates of Caribbean or even the more temperate climate of Britain. Commenting on the centennial anniversary of the Russian campaign, German historian Paul Holzhausen wrote that there was no campaign that was so abysmally written on the soul of the people as Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. He writes, "Not the war which the great Frederick fought with Austrians, the French, the Russians, with the finely coiffured Louis XV, with the wild Croats and Pandors of Maria Theresa, not the year of the Battle of Leipzig, nor the campaign of Waterloo, not even 1870, none." He pointed out that one could visit the fields of honor, as he describes it, of those other campaigns, but not for 1812. Did not return. That was a terrible phrase that passed through thousands of families, that was related by tearful fathers, mothers, sisters, and brides, writes Holzhausen. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was a calamitous event that shook the French Empire to its very foundation and led to its eventual collapse just a year and a half later. On Charles Joseph Minard's famous 1869 flow map that you can see on the screen, that graphically demonstrates Napoleon's fiasco in Russia, we can follow the gradually shrinking band representing the Grande Armée, each downscaling representing the loss of thousands of men. Looking at this remarkable chart, one cannot but wonder what had happened to tens of thousands of men and women who so simply disappeared from the graph. Napoleon had entered Russia with over 500,000 men and lost the vast majority of them over the next 6 months. By the end of December, when the last of Napoleon's soldiers crossed the Niemen River, barely 50,000 could be mustered. The purpose of my presentation, therefore, is to offer a glimpse, a survey within the short period of time that we have been allotted into the fate of some of the soldiers. The Napoleonic Wars posed many challenges to Russia, and the treatment of prisoners of war proved one of them, since none of Russia's previous conflicts produced as many prisoners of war as the wars against Napoleon. While not particularly successful against the French armies in 1805, 1806, Russians still managed to capture several thousand prisoners of war, the issue of what to do with these prisoners of war prompted significant revision of Russian regulations on the treatment of prisoners. The Russian Ministry of War approved the new statute on commanding a large active army that defined organization, structure, and functions of the Russian military during the Napoleonic Wars, at least the concluding years of Napoleonic Wars. And the same statute also dealt with the issue of prisoners of war. According to the statute, the duty office of the main staff handled all issues related to the treatment of POWs, while Hevaldiger General, who served as the chief of military police, handled enemy deserters. Once enemy soldiers were captured, they were supposed to be delivered to the regimental and then divisional headquarters, which in turn conveyed them to the corps headquarters and finally to the main staff, the precursor to later day general staff. The second section of the main staff, that of duty office, was responsible for providing immediate accommodation for the prisoners of war, and all POWs were presented to the commandant of the headquarters, who had them registered and properly processed before then considering where to dispatch them. Once decision was made, the convoy of the headquarters escorted prisoners to transportation points from where they were conveyed on the escort to detention centers. The statute contains specific provisions to prevent abuse of prisoners of war. For example, Articles 4.3 and 4.4, as well as 4.35, prohibited depriving prisoners of clothing or buying from them any items or impressing them into service against their will. The question of prisoners of war became one of the most challenging issues confronting the Russian authorities in 1812. Just days in the conflict, Russians already began capturing prisoners of war as well as deserters who were treated in accordance to the statute on commanding the large active army. The relevant Russian authorities quickly processed prisoners and conveyed them to nearby provinces. Initially, Kiev, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and Tver for detention. However, as the Grande Armée penetrated deeper into Russia, the prisoners of war had to be evacuated further eastward as far as Tambov. You can see right here. The system itself soon showed its weakness as the Russian military authorities struggled to deal with the ever-increasing number of prisoners while conducting military operations against Napoleon. Indeed, the Grande Armée suffered tremendous losses during this campaign. Aside from tens of thousands who perished on the battlefields or died of privation and cold weather, recent Russian studies, based on numerous documents in original archives of Russia, show that that by the end of the year, after roughly 6 months of fighting, the Russians were able to capture over 120,000 prisoners. The harsh winter of 1813, as well as popular violence, malnutrition, sickness, and hardship during transportation, meant that almost 2/3 of these men and women perished within weeks of captivity. Official reports from 48 Russian provinces revealed that well over 65,000 prisoners had died by February of 1813. As it might be expected, the highest number of prisoners perished in provinces where military operations took place and that were devastated, and therefore little accommodation could be provided for the sick and the wounded. For example, over 6,500 prisoners died in the Minsk province, some 8,000 died in Smolensk province, and over 5,000 died in the Vitebsk province. The Vilna province, where so many exhausted soldiers of the retreating Grande Armée were captured, had seen some 10,000 people die by spring of 1813. And I think many of you have followed the news of the archaeological digs on the outskirts of Vilnius that revealed the mass burials of these soldiers. The same official reports revealed that some 40,000 prisoners of war were still alive and held in detention centers throughout the empire, while another 3,500 prisoners had agreed to join the newly established Russo-German and Oreol legions to fight against Napoleon. The largest number of these prisoners were in western provinces, in Vilna, Minsk, Vitebsk, Saratov, in Kiev, but there were also a heavy concentration of prisoners in distant provinces of Vyatka, you can see here in these yellow dots, Orenburg, St. Petersburg, and Pskov. Among these roughly 40,000 prisoners were 37 generals, 190 staff officers, over 3,000 junior officers. The nationalities of the prisoners reflected the multi-ethnic composition of the Napoleonic armies. For example, a party of prisoners passing through Kaluga, including well over 1,000 Frenchmen, 622 Poles, 116 Italians, 100 Austrians, 92 Spaniards, 43 Dutchmen, 35 Portuguese, 9 Bavarians, and 7 Westphalians. The composition is slightly different for Nizhny Novgorod province, where you have the majority of them being French, followed by Italians, and the smallest contingent being Dutch, who only had 4 prisoners of war here. In early September, with the influx of these thousands of additional POWs, Russian authorities decided to introduce certain changes in the system to resolve 2 fundamental problems. First, removing prisoners of war from the theater of war and providing them with the necessary accommodation for the duration of the war. At the core of this system was the need to shift the responsibility from the military, which was still prosecuting this massive war against Napoleon, to civilian authorities that shored up the home front. Emperor Alexander of Russia approved the plan, and it was carried out through the Ministry of Police that had the authority over the provinces. The new initiative designated the distant Astrakhan, Perm, Orenburg, Saratov, and Vyatka provinces for the detention of prisoners of war, who had to be transported on the armed convoys provided by the Internal Guard Corps. Each convoy commander was required to maintain meticulous account of all expenses incurred during transportation of the prisoners. The decree specified that, quote, the prisoners must not be mistreated in any shape or form, but they must be required to behave humbly and obediently. They must be informed that they would bear collective responsibility for any transgressions. Once the convoy passed through a province, the convoy commander was required to obtain a letter from the province governor stating that the convoy had passed, quote, quietly and in good faith. Civilian authorities in every province were made responsible for providing clothing, shoes, provisions, as well as placing sick prisoners at local hospitals and providing all necessary care to them. Once the prisoners recovered, they were then conveyed to rejoin their comrades in the detention centers. Upon arriving to the designated province, prisoners were distributed among the cities and towns, where they were quartered with private citizens and were closely monitored by the local police. The case of the Penza province offers a good glimpse of how the system functioned. The local archives show that as of January of 1813, the local authorities in Penza had processed 2,428 prisoners of war who had been sent here from through Moscow province and then conveyed via Nizhny Novgorod and Tambov. Among the prisoners were 3 officers, Lieutenant Karl Pierpont, Sous-Lieutenants Léon Michel Posteau and Claude Bernard Vallot, who actually remained at the local hospital due to the sickness, while the rest were moved further east. General André-Philippe Corsan, with 25 officers and 2,346 men, were sent to Saratov, while 6 other officers and 22 soldiers were moved to Vyatka up in the north. In the spring of 1813, the Penza province received hundreds of prisoners that, instead of being sent further to detention center, were actually kept in Penza. Among them were a number of German officers, including Ludwig von Jelen, who later wrote rather fascinating memoir about his experiences here. These prisoners were distributed among the various towns inside the Penza province, were registered with the local police, and then allowed to settle in and wait. Prisoners were allowed to send and receive letters, which were, of course, examined by local authorities. They were allowed even to receive money from their families, and local archives actually show prisoners receiving such payments. For example, Captain Landsberg and Lieutenant Mathieu received an equivalent of 500 rubles in transfers from home. Furthermore, Empress Consort Elizabeth Alexeyevna, the wife of Emperor Alexander, who was born as Badenese Princess Louise, took particular care for her former compatriots and facilitated the transfer from the Duchy of Baden of over 7,000 rubles worth of financial aid for the prisoner needs in 1813. There are many interesting details in these documents. For example, in September of 1813, Lieutenant Pinault challenged Lieutenant Paris to a duel and even produced 2 loaded pistols that they could use to fight a duel. Now, the locals quickly apprehended them and then informed the police officials, who were quite bewildered to discover that the prisoners of war were actually armed. Asked how he was able to obtain the pistols, Pinault rather bluntly told the police that he actually never parted with them and that he simply bought the pistol balls and gunpowder from other prisoners. In July 1813, the rank-and-file prisoners were allowed to become Russian subjects by taking an oath of loyalty to the Russian sovereign, but they were restricted in terms of areas, the regions where they could settle. For example, they could not choose to live in Poland, what will be the Congress of Poland. They could not settle in Finland, or they could not live in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Once pledging allegiance, the newly minted Russian subjects had 9 months to decide what profession they would pursue. The Russian government no longer required conversion to Orthodoxy among the prisoners, although the Holy Synod long upheld the same rules concerning marriages between prisoners and the Orthodox Russians. Now, although prisoners were initially denied the right of correspondence, these restrictions were later relaxed, though tight censorship was maintained. Prisoners were required to deliver the unsealed letters to a local police official who reviewed content before giving permission to mail the letter. Now, in the spring of 1814, the remaining prisoners, except for the Poles, were allowed to conduct legal affairs involving their property and estate back home through correspondence. The transportation and accommodation of prisoners imposed considerable strains on the Russian population. Although instructions to police and city officials specified that accommodation had to be provided without inconvenience to local populace, the very nature of this enterprise caused considerable tensions and conflicts. Prisoners were quartered with private citizens who grumbled, unsurprisingly, about extra expenses they had to bear to keep these, quote, accursed invaders, and who also were quite concerned about the spread of contagious diseases that prisoners could be carrying. In late December of 1812, the Ministry of Police, for example, was compelled to send out a new circular letter to the provincial authorities instructing them to quarantine newly arriving prisoners and to take immediate measures to bury or burn bodies of prisoners who had fallen during the transportation. Now, the cold weather, which wrought such a havoc on the Grande Armée, actually proved to be a blessing for the Russian authorities, since it prevented thousands of bodies from rapidly decomposing and potentially causing a deadly outbreak of disease. Divided by linguistic, cultural, social barriers, local inhabitants and prisoners oftentimes quarreled. Locals complained that prisoners were engaged in thievery, that they were not careful in handling fire. Complaints about drunk prisoners causing ruckus were quite rather widespread. In the town of Arzamas, for example, a retired soldier complained that a group of French officers got drunk and forced their way into the room of his house where a young woman was living, intending, quote, to commit a shameful act on her. The officer, the retired soldier, tried to defend the woman, but was beaten and kicked out, and only the intervention of the city authorities put an end to this bacchanalia, and the captive prisoners were then relocated to other towns. As required by regulations, the prisoners received financial support from the Russian government. The payments to officers and soldiers were in fact increased at one point during the detention, and these monies were allocated from the funds of local and provincial authorities, who also had to contribute provisions and clothing. So, therefore, many Russian provinces found themselves shouldering heavy financial burden of maintaining the prisoners of war. In the months of August of 1813 alone, for example, the fiscal chamber in the Sloboda, Ukraine province allocated over 12,000 rubles for prisoners of war, while Kaluga authorities had to spend hundreds of rubles to transport the prisoners and acquire for them sheepskin coats, hats, shirts, stockings, boots, peasant bath shoes to meet the basic needs of prisoners, which cost additional thousands of rubles. In October of 1813, in order to reduce the expenses related to the prisoner upkeep, the Ministry of Police declared that the rank and file prisoners were required to buy their own clothing and shoes, while the officers were provided a subsidy of 100 rubles to acquire proper clothing. Russian government had long made efforts to attract skilled foreigners to promote industry and agriculture in Russia. The capture of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers offered a golden opportunity to attract the most skilled or industrious of these soldiers. Already in December of 1812, the Minister of Police instructed provincial governors to interrogate prisoners and ascertain any one of them with expertise in textile industry. In January of 1813, the Ministry of Police then issued a detailed instruction that called for classifying all prisoners into 4 categories. The first category included Poles, who, as, quote, treasonous rebels, were condemned to exile to Caucasus, to my own homeland of Georgia, or to the Siberian line, where they required to join local regiments, effectively performing active service in the imperial armed forces. This measure, the letter said, this measure would not only reduce the expenses our treasury accrues for maintaining the Polish prisoners, but will also free up recruits to reinforce armies fighting against France. In the second category were those prisoners who demonstrated their technical abilities, especially those that could be used, quote, to advantage in our own factories and industrial enterprises. Such soldiers were to be selected, dispatched to factories, and paid at the same rate as Russians. In the third category were prisoners who were from a farming background and who should have been encouraged to settle as colonists in various provinces of Russia. And finally, in the fourth category were those showing skill either in industry and agriculture who could be used to restore the Russian cities that had been ruined by the war. Although not mentioned in this instruction, the Russian authorities placed captured medical personnel into a separate category, with thousands of sick, wounded soldiers, a vast majority of them lacking sufficient medical care. Russian authorities were clearly keen on offering generous terms to French and German physicians, including complete freedom and full pay. Russian attitudes were frequently shaped by the nationality of prisoners. It must be noted that Russian authorities determined nationality not by the place of birth, but rather based on the origin of unit where prisoners served. The long-standing tradition of admiration for French culture meant that the French prisoners of war, especially officers, were in fact treated quite leniently. Yuri Arnold, writing from the province of Mogilev, noted the obsession with all the things French that his fellow Russians had in the province, which led to a situation when, quote, it was rare at that time to find a noble residence in which one didn't meet a French prisoner. To have at home one's own Frenchman had become an established practice for every respectable home. My family consequently found our own Frenchmen as well. Interestingly, Spanish and Portuguese prisoners were treated rather well. They were all dispatched to St. Petersburg, where the rank and file received higher daily allowance than any other nationality. Such leniency was the result of both the existing Treaty of Veliki Luki that established an alliance between Russia and Spain against France, as well as the Russian desire to recruit these prisoners into one of the foreign legions that were formed in the spring of 1813. The Dutch, the Haitian, the Hanoverian, and Italian prisoners were also offered opportunity to enlist and fight. On the other hand, the Poles were treated quite harshly. The first prisoners of war were released in January as early as January 1813, when in the wake of the Convention of Torogen, a Russian government released the captured Prussian prisoners. And then over the next year and a half, as the campaign unfolded and as more and more other German states switched sides and joined the coalition, the Russian authorities began releasing those prisoners. The biggest release of the prisoners took place naturally after the end of the war in 1814, when thousands of them were conveyed in batches across the provinces to the borderlands and then allowed to travel back home. The remaining Allied provinces, most of them from France, but also from places like Dalmatia, Croatia, Naples, were released in the summer and fall of 1814. Despite their experiences in captivity, some prisoners of war did choose to stay in Russia, finding prospects of staying in the foreign land more attractive than returning home. After pledging allegiance to the Russian sovereign, a few of them enlisted in the Russian army, but most settled in various towns and villages, working in industry, farming, and gradually assimilating into the Russian society. Thank you.